Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The United Earth Diplomatic Corps had prepared for this moment for years, though no amount of training could completely quell the tension that hummed in the command center as Jackson Cole gazed out the viewport. Beyond the reinforced glass, the vast expanse of space shimmered, the deep black flecked with stars. But it wasn't the stars that commanded his attention. It was the sleek, otherworldly ship hovering in the distance, its design unlike anything human eyes had ever seen, the Zelnari. The first truly intelligent alien race humanity had encountered. Their ship was not made of metal or any material that Jackson could identify. Instead, it seemed almost organic, like a living entity floating effortlessly in space. The hull pulsed faintly with light, and Jackson could sense the power radiating from within, a testament to their technological superiority. Beside him, Admiral Langford crossed his arms, his face a mask of tension. "They're not responding to our hails," the Admiral said gruffly, his voice betraying the stress beneath his stern exterior. Jackson exhaled slowly, forcing his nerves to settle. This was his moment. The first official contact between humanity and an alien species, and he had been chosen to lead the mission. It was the dream of every diplomat, but as he stood on the precipice of history, Jackson realized just how unprepared he felt. "They're observing us," Jackson replied calmly, though the knot in his stomach told a different story. "They're trying to understand us as much as we are trying to understand them." The Zelnari were a mystery. Their communication was telepathic, a fact that had been discovered after a brief, disastrous first encounter with a scouting party months earlier. Since then, all contact had been indirect, mediated through complex translation algorithms. But now, face to face, the challenge would be to bridge that gap without igniting a war. The silence stretched, broken only by the steady hum of the ship's systems. Jackson felt the weight of millions of lives resting on this moment. One wrong word, one misunderstood gesture, and humanity could be plunged into a conflict it could not possibly win. The Zelnari were far more advanced, both technologically and culturally. But Jackson had spent his entire career preparing for the unknown, studying alien languages, cultures, and forms of communication, even those of species yet to be encountered. Suddenly, the ship's communications array flickered to life. A holographic projection appeared before them, and there, standing tall and imposing, was the Zelnari representative, Minister Vaylor. His form was humanoid but with distinct differences: elongated limbs, bioluminescent skin that shifted colors in undulating waves, and eyes that glowed faintly with an inner light. His gaze was piercing, scrutinizing. "Human delegation," came a voice through the translator. It was calm, measured, yet filled with an unfamiliar cadence that spoke to the alien's telepathic nature. "You have violated our space. Explain yourselves." Jackson stepped forward, his heart racing but his expression composed. "Minister Vaylor, I am Jackson Cole, representing the United Earth government. We come in peace, seeking to establish communication and understanding between our two species." Vaylor's bioluminescent skin shifted colors, a rapid pulse of blue and green that made Jackson pause. He had studied the Zelnari as much as he could, but their language of colors was complex, and the nuances often escaped him. "You have already failed in your piece," Vaylor replied, the tone hardening. "Your gestures are strange, your words incomplete. Do you presume to understand us?" Jackson felt a bead of sweat forming at his temple, but he kept his voice steady. "We are still learning, Minister. We mean no offense. Our cultures are vastly different, but we believe that through dialogue, we can bridge the gap and find common ground." There was a long pause as Vaylor observed him, his eyes narrowing slightly. The room around Jackson felt charged with tension, every breath heavy with the weight of what could follow. "You misunderstand," Vaylor said finally. "You speak words that carry no meaning. Your actions are foreign, your presence an intrusion. Our history is long, and we do not welcome intruders lightly." Jackson's mind raced. He had expected some form of hostility, but this was worse than he had anticipated. The Zelnari weren't just suspicious, they were on the verge of outright rejection, perhaps even war. It was then that Jackson noticed something, a slight shift in the colors radiating from Vaylor's skin, a subtle flicker of yellow intermingled with the blue. His studies rushed back to him. Yellow. It was the color of confusion, of hesitation. Vaylor wasn't completely resolute in his stance. Jackson took a deep breath. He had to act quickly. "Minister Vaylor," he began, choosing his words carefully, "we recognize that our presence here may seem sudden, and our ways unfamiliar. But we are not here to impose or intrude. We are here to learn from you, to understand your greatness, and to share in the knowledge that both our species can offer." The words seemed to have an effect. Vaylor's skin shifted again, the colors changing more slowly now. The silence that followed felt heavy, but Jackson sensed something had shifted in the minister's demeanor. "You seek knowledge?" Vaylor asked, his voice softer this time. "Why would we share what you cannot comprehend?" Jackson stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Because understanding is the key to peace. And through peace, both our civilizations can thrive in ways we never thought possible. The galaxy is vast, and we have much to learn from each other." Vaylor remained silent for a moment longer, then turned to the side, as if considering the proposal. The tension in the room thickened, and Jackson could feel the eyes of everyone in the command center fixed on him. One wrong move and this entire mission could collapse. The Zelnari leader finally turned back to Jackson, his glowing eyes meeting the humans. "You may speak further. But know this, human, if we find deceit in your words, or disrespect in your actions, there will be no further dialogue. Only conflict." Jackson inclined his head slightly, a respectful gesture, careful not to bow too deeply. His training had taught him that the Zelnari viewed such actions as weakness. "I understand, Minister Vaylor. And I give you my word, we come with honesty and respect." The communication ended abruptly, leaving the room in stunned silence. Jackson exhaled slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Admiral Langford let out a breath of his own. That could have gone worse. Jackson nodded, though he knew the hard part was only just beginning. As the days passed, the human delegation remained in orbit around Arctera, exchanging cautious messages with the Zelnari. Jackson spent hours poring over the nuances of Zelnari culture, learning their communication patterns, their social structures, their unspoken rules. It was exhausting work, but he couldn't afford to miss even the smallest detail, and yet, despite his efforts, tensions continued to simmer. Misunderstandings arose at every turn, simple gestures taken as insults, well-meaning words lost in translation. Each time, Jackson was forced to navigate the delicate dance of diplomacy, diffusing situations before they could ignite into something far worse. It was during one of these tense negotiations that Jackson made a breakthrough. In the middle of a particularly heated discussion with Minister Vaylor, he noticed a peculiar reaction. Vaylor's skin pulsed with a deep shade of purple, a color that Jackson had rarely seen before. It was subtle, but it carried a depth of emotion that intrigued him. Later that night, Jackson reviewed the Zelnari cultural texts once more, searching for any reference to the color. And then he found it, purple, the color of grief. It hit him then, like a bolt of lightning. The Zelnari weren't just suspicious of humanity, they were grieving. Their history was filled with loss, wars with other species, failed alliances, broken promises. They had been burned before, and now they were wary of trusting again. Armed with this knowledge, Jackson approached the next negotiation with a new perspective. Instead of focusing solely on humanity's desire for peace, he acknowledged the Zelnari's pain, their past wounds. He spoke of loss, of the struggles humanity had faced in its own history, wars, betrayals, and the hard-earned lessons of trust. Vaylor listened, his gaze inscrutable, but his skin shifted slowly to a softer hue. The tension in the room seemed to ease, if only slightly. "You understand more than I expected," Vaylor said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual hardness. Jackson met his gaze, a flicker of hope rising within him. "We are not so different, Minister. We have both faced challenges, both experienced loss. But we have also learned that through cooperation, we can build something stronger than we could ever achieve alone." Vaylor was silent for a long time, and Jackson could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Finally, the Zelnari leader nodded slowly. "There may be a way forward," Vaylor said. "But it will not be easy." "I never expected it to be," Jackson replied, and so, the negotiations continued, each day bringing new challenges, but also new opportunities for understanding. Jackson and Vaylor worked tirelessly, slowly chipping away at the barriers that had stood between their two species. But just as it seemed that peace was within reach, a new threat emerged, a rogue faction within the Zelnari, determined to sabotage the negotiations and drive humanity away once and for all. They launched a covert attack on the human delegation's ship, disabling its defenses and leaving the crew vulnerable. Jackson was thrown into chaos. He had been so focused on the diplomatic front that he hadn't anticipated a direct attack. As alarms blared and the ship's systems failed, he realized that everything they had worked for could be undone in an instant. But Jackson was nothing if not resourceful. In the midst of the chaos, he managed to reach Minister Vaylor, pleading for his help. It was a gamble. There was no guarantee that Vaylor would believe him, or that he would even be able to stop the rogue faction. To Jackson's surprise, Vaylor acted swiftly. The Zelnari leader dispatched his own forces to neutralize the rogue attackers, demonstrating his commitment to the peace process. Together, they worked to restore order, and the rogue faction was exposed and brought to justice. In the aftermath, the bond between Jackson and Vaylor solidified. The Zelnari leader had seen firsthand humanity's resilience, their determination to pursue peace even in the face of adversity. And Jackson had earned Vaylor's respect not just as a diplomat, but as an equal. The final negotiations were swift, and a historic peace treaty was signed, marking the beginning of a new era of cooperation between humanity and the Zelnari. The treaty outlined mutual respect, non-aggression, and the sharing of knowledge and resources, paving the way for both species to thrive. The treaty was signed in a grand ceremony on Arctera. Jackson stood beside Vaylor, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. He had done it. Against all odds, he had averted war and forged an alliance that would shape the future of both species. "Do you believe this will last?" Vaylor asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Jackson smiled faintly. "I think we've proven that anything is possible, as long as we're willing to understand each other." Vaylor glanced at him, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. "Perhaps you are right, Jackson Cole. Perhaps there is hope for us after all." And as the stars shimmered above them, Jackson allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. Humanity's place in the galaxy had been secured, not through force, but through diplomacy, understanding, and the simple act of listening. It was the beginning of a new chapter in galactic history, and Jackson knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Jackson lingered on the Zelnari homeworld longer than expected. The ceremony had concluded, but there was still much work to be done, small details in the treaty to finalize, cultural exchange programs to organize, and the ever-growing list of communications that needed to be reviewed. The galaxy felt both smaller and larger now, with humanity officially stepping into a broader universe. As he walked through the expansive halls of the Zelnari capital, he marveled at how different their architecture was. Everything seemed to grow organically, as if the buildings themselves were alive. The walls pulsed with a faint light, and the air carried an odd but not unpleasant scent, a reminder of the fundamental differences between their species. Yet despite the alien nature of his surroundings, Jackson felt a strange sense of peace. Minister Vaylor had remained an enigma, even after their successful negotiations. Though the alien leader had shown a willingness to understand and compromise, there was always a flicker of something else behind his eyes, an old sorrow, perhaps, or a lingering doubt about the future of their alliance. Jackson had come to respect the minister's guarded nature. After all, neither species had expected this partnership to form. Trust, as Jackson had learned, was a slow and delicate process. Human diplomat, a familiar voice echoed softly in Jackson's mind as Vaylor approached, his bioluminescent skin radiating a soft blue hue, the sign of calm contemplation. You remain here longer than most. Does your species always overstay their welcomes? Jackson smiled, the gentle humor in the minister's words clear, even without the nuance of telepathic tones. I prefer to think of it as thoroughness. I wouldn't want to leave any details unresolved. Vaylor nodded, his gaze shifting to the distant horizon, where the sky shimmered with hues Jackson had never seen on Earth. Indeed. It is in the details where misunderstandings often arise. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, both gazing out at the surreal beauty of Arctera. Jackson had learned to appreciate these quiet moments with Vaylor. The Zelnari didn't rush through conversations or need constant validation through words. Their communication was as much about presence as it was about speech. You have secured peace, for now, Vaylor said after a long pause, his tone neutral but his skin flashing a brief, deeper shade of purple, a sign of internal conflict. But peace is fragile. The galaxy is vast, and not all will agree with what we have done here. Jackson understood the weight of the minister's words. Though the rogue faction within the Zelnari had been dealt with, there would undoubtedly be more challenges ahead. Back on Earth, there were factions of their own who viewed the Zelnari with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Diplomacy was an ongoing effort, and the work was never truly done. I'm not naive, Jackson replied, his voice steady. I know this is only the beginning. There will be opposition, on both sides. But that's why we have to keep talking, keep finding ways to bridge the gaps between us. Vaylor turned to face him fully, his glowing eyes narrowing slightly. And if talking fails? What then, human? Jackson met his gaze without hesitation. Then we try again. And again. Because the alternative is war, and neither of us can afford that. The minister's skin pulsed again, this time with a mix of colors Jackson had come to recognize as approval. Vaylor's gaze softened, and the tension between them seemed to ease. You are a stubborn species, Vaylor said, though his tone carried no malice. Perhaps that is why we have found common ground. Jackson chuckled. We do have a tendency to persist. The conversation shifted to more practical matters, the next steps in the peace process, the exchange of diplomats, the establishment of joint scientific ventures. Vaylor's keen intellect and meticulous attention to detail made these discussions both challenging and rewarding, and Jackson found himself deeply engaged in the work. As the days stretched into weeks, Jackson's role shifted from that of a negotiator to a bridge between their two species. The Zelnari were as curious about humans as humanity was about them, and soon there were daily discussions about everything from technology to art to philosophy. The more Jackson learned about the Zelnari, the more he realized how much they had in common, despite their differences, but the peace remained tenuous. On Earth, political factions questioned the wisdom of aligning with a species so alien, while whispers of dissent grew among certain Zelnari castes. Jackson could feel the undercurrents of tension, the fragile nature of the agreement they had worked so hard to achieve. It was late one evening when Jackson received an urgent message from Earth. Admiral Langford's voice crackled through the secure line, his usual stoic demeanor replaced with a hint of concern. "Jackson, we've got a problem." Jackson's stomach tightened. "What's happened?" "There's been an incident on the colony world of Duro. A Zelnari envoy was attacked by humans. The situation's escalating quickly. We need you to get back here, fast." Jackson's heart sank. Duro was a mining colony on the outer edge of human-controlled space, a rugged world with a population that had never fully embraced the idea of alien diplomacy. He had known there would be pushback, but an attack on a Zelnari envoy was far worse than he had anticipated. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Jackson said, already gathering his things. Vaylor appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable but his skin flashing a muted shade of orange, concern. "You are needed elsewhere, it seems." Jackson nodded, meeting Vaylor's gaze. "There's been an incident. I have to go." The minister studied him for a moment, then stepped aside, allowing Jackson to pass. "Do not let this peace we have built crumble, human." Jackson paused, feeling the weight of the words. "I won't." The journey back to Earth was tense, every second feeling like an eternity as Jackson reviewed the details of the situation. The attack on the Zelnari envoy had been unprovoked, a small group of extremists who viewed the aliens as a threat to humanity's independence. The Zelnari had retaliated in self-defense, and now both sides were on the verge of open conflict. When Jackson arrived at Duro, the atmosphere was charged with hostility. The mining town where the incident had occurred was a desolate place, its rough streets filled with angry crowds demanding justice for the humans who had been caught in the crossfire. Jackson could see the deep divisions already forming, fear and mistrust festering like an open wound. Admiral Langford greeted him with a grim nod as he stepped off the transport. "We've got about 12 hours before this boils over. The Zelnari warships are holding position just outside the colony's airspace, and they're not happy." Jackson took a deep breath, steeling himself for the task ahead. "What's the status of the envoy?" "Injured, but alive. They're demanding retribution. If we don't act fast, this whole thing could spiral out of control." Jackson knew what he had to do. He had faced difficult situations before, but this was different. The peace he had worked so hard to achieve was hanging by a thread, and now it was up to him to pull it back from the brink. The negotiations were brutal. The human extremists refused to back down, their hatred of the Zelnari too deeply ingrained for logic or reason to penetrate. On the other side, the Zelnari delegation, led by a high-ranking official named Zaylorn, demanded justice and restitution for the attack on their envoy. Jackson found himself caught between two worlds, each side demanding answers, each side pushing closer to the edge of war. But he refused to give in to despair. He knew that peace was possible, even in the face of such animosity. As the hours passed, Jackson worked tirelessly to broker a compromise. He appealed to the humanity in the extremists, reminding them of the broader consequences of their actions. He spoke to the Zelnari with the same calm resolve he had shown during his initial negotiations, emphasizing that retaliation would only lead to further bloodshed. Slowly, painfully, progress was made. The extremists agreed to stand down, and the Zelnari accepted a diplomatic resolution that would allow both sides to save face. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to prevent the outbreak of war. By the time the crisis was resolved, Jackson was exhausted, his body and mind pushed to their limits. But as he stood on the barren surface of Duro, watching the Zelnari ships retreat into the distance, he allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph. The peace had held.